St. Louis County Library and HEC Media, I'm thrilled to be speaking today with Ioan Grillo. Ioan is a contributing writer at the New York Times, specializing in crime and drugs. His previous books include El Narco, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and Gangster Warlords, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Today, he joins us to share Blood, Gun, Money: How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. The books are available at Novel Neighbor. I'm Ben Westhoff. I'm an investigative journalist working in St. Louis and the author of two books, Fentanyl Inc. and Original Gangstas. So Ioan, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Ben. Great to talk to you and great to be here with the St. Louis organization.
Absolutely. So maybe just give us a sense of where the idea for the book started.
Yeah, sure, Ben. So I'm right now talking from Mexico City. I've been here for 20 years. I came here from the UK 20 years ago. And very early on in Mexico, it wasn't my plan originally, but very early on in Mexico, began covering drug cartels and violence. And in the years that I spent here, this issue that began as being quite a glamorous thing to cover, this idea of these kingpins with their big mansions and lions and tigers and jewels, really turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. And I found myself covering what is essentially an armed conflict, a weird hybrid armed conflict, covering things like 49 bodies dumped on a road, all of them with their heads, hands and feet cut off. There were gun battles with 500 hitmen against 2,000 federal police. So, I wrote two books about this and trying to understand what had happened and how this had come about in Mexico. And always behind that was this issue of the guns coming from the United States. Now, this is something we knew about, people knew about. I wrote stories about this 15 years ago. But I always thought it was a kind of a brick wall. We could never really gain much attention or get the United States to change on this issue. But that changed for me in 2017 when I was interviewing a gun trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez. And he explained to me how he was going to the United States, buying AR-15s by the dozen with no paperwork at all and bringing them to Mexico. And I started to really look about how the traffic was working. And I realized, well, maybe there are things to write about here. There are things to investigate, and there is room to change on this issue. Even respecting the Second Amendment, respecting people's right to bear arms, there's things that the actually laws themselves are not being enforced. And how is it, and the numbers are crazy, that they're saying that 2 million firearms were trafficked from the United States to cartels in the last 10 years. So this has now really become a big issue, in fact, that the Mexican government is very concerned about. And I think there is in the United States also now space to talk about the firearms issue.
A lot of Americans talk about when the issue of gun control comes up, the fact that criminals are always going to have guns and therefore law-abiding citizens should be able to have them. What do you make of this argument? And, I know you're from the UK originally, and I know that they don't have nearly as many guns or nearly as much problems with gun violence. How do these things all relate together?
So the idea that, we can't do anything about this. I mean, there's a few things there. So, first in the book, I don't make an argument against the Second Amendment. I simply say there's very, very basic things you can do now. Like, for example, if you get, and these are solid, real cases. If you get a guy who walks to the shop and buys 10 identical AK-47s and they're for the cartels, run a check, have a look at that. These are happening without anything. The single people are buying 500 firearms. Single individuals buying 500 firearms and they're being trafficked. And that's not being checked. That people are, spending $750,000 on guns and then ending up getting probation. The way that these are treated. So first of all, just saying this basic stuff that could be done and investigate. It's a work of investigation, not preaching on this. But getting into that deeper issue of, first I do believe we see in different countries, and you mentioned Europe. I mean, there has been attempts after a lot of the mass shootings that happened in Europe, like the Bataclan in Paris. In fact, look at the firearms in that particular case. They were made in a factory in Serbia, which I went to, and were trafficked over time and then used by the people saying they're part of the Islamic State and killing a bunch of people in a club in Paris. There was a big attempt after that in Europe to cut down on illegal guns. Then you saw some other terrorist attacks late last year, and they were using knives because that attempts have been quite successful in making it more difficult for them to get firearms. So to say we can't do anything is not true. Currently, right now, people, you really believe, I think in the United States, there's an idea put forward that people are defending themselves against organized crime because they have firearms in their house and that kind of thing. You realize that's not really the case. People are defending themselves, and this is including, very, very pro-gun people, are defending themselves largely against organized crime because the federal government has hit organized crime very hard. If you see what it's like in Mexico, if you're dealing with 20 guys with AK-47s, even if I have a pistol, I can't do anything about these guys. Even if I have a rifle, I can't do anything about these guys. And then you get whole bunches of people rising up as vigilantes, and then you get 100, 200 regular citizens with guns. And that might, you think, well, that's a solution in the short term, and they run the cartel out of town. But then those guys then suddenly become the ones shaking people down, disappearing people, doing all this kind of shady stuff as well. So this real idea that this kind of if everyone has guns, you're going to be safe. The other thing is that in the United States, there's still debate about, okay, what guns should people have? How big firearms? Should they be allowed tanks? Should people be allowed guns in prison? Obviously not now. That sounds like something a bit like obvious, but I've been in prisons in Latin America where they literally have had guns, where they have had Uzis on their chest they're carrying around. So you see then that you have to make a deliberate attempt to enforce these kind of things. So there's a lot of deeper debate, I think, rather than saying everyone's going to have guns and that's going to create some kind of peaceful situation that way.
Let's talk about the ATF, which is the American agency primarily in charge of monitoring gun sales and crimes. Were you shocked to learn that they're actually prohibited from using an electronic database to keep track of all the guns?
Yeah, I was surprised by this. So if people don't know this, and according to the ATF Trade Center, a lot of police in the United States don't know this. You find the smoking gun from the crime scene. You call up the ATF Trade Center. So we've got the gun here. Here's the serial number. Give us a trace. Put it in your computer. They say, well, we can't do that. We have to phone up the company which made the gun, and then ask them who they sold it to as a supplier. Then phone them up and find, and follow the trace. And the average time is 11 days. And that's because the gun lobby has been so strong that they've put prohibitions on exactly the fact they can't even trace guns. That if you inspect a gun shop that might be selling guns off the books to criminals, to people with felonies, if you inspect them once in a year, you can't inspect them to the following year. So there's all of these things. There's federal laws saying that if you're keeping pharmacies, you have to have them locked up. If you're keeping money, it has to be locked up. If you're keeping firearms, there's no law, so people go break into these places and take guns out of unlocked cabinets. So these things, they're quite incredible. But the ATF is a curious agency, and I think there is a paradox there, a big central paradox, in that the United States, whereas it has the biggest firearms market in the world, both legal and illegal, whereas it has the biggest drug market in the world for illegal drugs, it has these federal agencies that are quite strong at hitting certain organized crime. Whereas here in Mexico, in Latin America, you don't see that. Here, you see very, very weak, dysfunctional law enforcement. And then you see this level of crime and what it looks like and how much that hurts communities. And that is something quite traumatic when you see this.
You've noted that a lot of this really goes back to the influence of the NRA, the gun lobby in the US. And you also talk about how the NRA has faced some financial difficulties in recent years. At the same time, though, the organization still seems to be as powerful as ever, at least from the outside. Do you think that we'll see a waning of the NRA's influence in our lifetime?
I mean, the NRA and American gun culture has not been a static thing. It's been something that's moved and changed over the years. So we go back to the original NRA, formed in New York. One of the two men who founded it had worked for the New York Times. So you see how different things were back then. There were people in the North, in the side of the Civil War veterans, wanted to teach straight shooting. You see the NRA in the 1930s when the 1934 firearms laws came out there to restrict the machine guns being used at the time by Al Capone's people and this kind of thing. And they were, saying, we're in favor of gun laws then, right up to the 1960s. And then you saw in the 70s, this radicalization of the NRA. And this, particularly under Harlan Carter, this man from Texas who at 17 years old shot dead a 15-year-old Mexican teenager. And went on to head the NRA with this very, very radical discourse. And then I think we've seen a mutation again in the last 10 years where the NRA have really picked up on the more populist rhetoric of Trump and this idea of the people trying to take the guns, the elite trying to take the guns, the people fighting back, and becoming very much a media machine selling a lifestyle. And then that got them into certain trouble, all of the kind of financial dealings they had with their PR company and then various things. They're now being kind of chased out of New York with this suit. So I think we will see them change, and they will go through a change again now, possibly, and trying to be optimistic about this stuff. I think there is space now for gun reform, for finding central ground on this thing. Universal background checks, just saying simply, if the law is you have to check your criminal record to buy a gun, have that applied to all gun sales. Don't have this loophole that allows 20% of those gun sales to go through that. And I found in my research, people are exploiting that to traffic guns to Mexico. To say people, if people are being paid by a drug cartel to go in and buy 20 AK-47s, don't give them probation. These are guns being used to murder children. If that was if that was a case where they found out that those same guns were used to be murdering, kids in the suburbs of America, I think there'll be harder sentencing for them. But because often these are traced to murders in Mexico, it's like, well, we don't care about giving real enforcement for this. But I think giving proper sentencing there. So on these grounds, there is room for something to come to. When it comes to things like the assault rifle ban, again, to bring in that's a lot harder to try and bring that in again. But there's a lot of things before we even get to that, which there could be compromise on.
As I'm sure you know, St. Louis is judged by some metrics to have the worst violent crime problem in the entire country. You talk a lot about Baltimore in the book and spent time there, which also has a horrible problem. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found in Baltimore and how that sort of portends for people living in St. Louis?
Yeah, sure. So what I discovered looking into this is you have this huge black market in firearms, illegal market in firearms that stretches around the United States, and then the same firearms then pour down to Mexico and beyond. I mean, we're talking about more than 130 countries the firearms from the US retail market end up. So I wanted to understand how the guns are moving around and the kind of iron pipelines going around the United States. And also what I discovered was very much there's a kind of link between the gun trafficking and the drug trafficking. I describe this as being two venomous plants wrapped around each other. So in Baltimore, what you see is often guns being traded for drugs coming in from Virginia, Georgia, and going to the people often selling drugs on the corners there. And this kind of evolution, people want guns to protect drug business. The drug business is huge there in terms of a retail drug market. What I saw as well, and I think it's interesting pertaining to St. Louis and to Baltimore compared to the violence that I've been covering in Latin America, in Mexico and Latin America for the last 20 years. the levels of murder in St. Louis and Baltimore are comparable to some cities in Latin America, to some cities in Mexico. So, I mean, for me, it's mind-blowing that this in the United States happens, and that it is also puzzling it doesn't get more attention in the United States, which I think is for some very dense and intense political issues in the United States, the way it's kind of handled and seen. But some of the differences is that that level of violence is there, and people say this is terrible, it couldn't get any worse. You actually see in some cities in Latin America how it can get worse, and that it can go from 60 homicides per 100,000 to 100 to 120 to 150, and then you see what that looks like in a city. When you see what Juarez looked like at its worst, what Medellin looks like, what Tijuana looks like, you see things like kidnapping for ransom when that happens, and that starts to really affect communities. And also the type of guns, you see what it's like when people suddenly, it goes from being pistols and handguns to more AK-47s, AR-15s, and then big 50 cals like blowing stuff away. So you see that it also does still have ways, and you have to even keep an eye on this and look at this. But also, I think in the United States has violent neighborhoods. It has violent cities, but particularly violent neighborhoods. In Mexico and Latin America, you see violent states, entire states that have the level of violence that you might see in St. Louis or Baltimore.
There's a big mayoral election going on right now. And if you had any, and these gun murders have really emerged as perhaps the primary issue. If you had any advice for the candidates about that issue, what would it be?
I look at three things, and I think this applies, kind of globally, this issue of crime and drugs and violence. Three areas. One, I think, is try and reduce the black market of drug money. I mean, it's this incentive which drives a huge amounts of violence. And I mean, in the United States, you've got people spending $150 billion a year on illegal drugs. And then you see a lot of bartering with guns and drugs. So first, I think you have to look at the issue of how do you reduce that money going into this market, and look at drug policy reform in that sense. The second, I think, is in terms of the rehabilitation of communities, of opportunities. The people in Baltimore I'm interviewing who at 17 years old could make $3,500 standing on a corner and selling heroin and crack, and that is the market there. And you see the same stories out of Baltimore, more extreme stories in Latin America. But I've spent a lot of time the last 20 years interviewing hitmen, assassins, people involved in organized crime, and it's the lack of opportunities given by the formal system and the opportunities provided by organized crime, the institutionalization of organized crime in this sense. So I think it's giving the opportunities, really investing in the communities and investing in the right way in the communities that provide people with opportunities not to go into these criminal organizations. And then the third thing, I mean, it's policing, which is a very heavily debated issue in the United States. But policing which really serves and responds to people's needs, I think that has to be an issue. So those are the three issues that I would focus on. As a mayor in St. Louis, and as president in Mexico, to try and stop this level of violence that we're living right now.
So during how much of your reporting were you wearing a bulletproof vest?
Very little. Generally, when I cover Mexico, Latin America, I don't wear bulletproof vests most of the time because this is a weird conflict that's happening. It's not like you've got very, very clear sides. You're going around into neighborhoods, talking to people. You're not going to walk around with security in a bulletproof vest. In terms of how I do work security here, and I've got 20 years now of covering this conflict and going down. Sometimes the occasions that I will wear bulletproof vests sometimes is if I'm going on a particular police operation, military operation, and they give me one. Sometimes they won't give me one. And in those kind of circumstances, sometimes if I'm going to a certain area, I will ask the police and say, I'm going to go into this village. Can you come and give me some backup here? Sometimes I've asked that of the self-defense vigilantes. I said, I'm going to do this. I went to one village in a place called Michoacan, and there's a guy basically who was self-defense vigilantes, but a bit of a shady guy. And I said, I'm going to go there. And he goes, oh, and he sent 15 armed guys with me to go to these illegal iron mines. So there's different ways, but a lot of the time, like I've been up to Chapo's village, the village of El Chapo Guzman in the mountains of Sinaloa. And when you go up there and they're, the cartel guys are blatantly driving around on quad bikes with AK-47s, you're basically at their mercy. Drive in there and, you give them a wave to these guys and, you go in there, and we met up with El Chapo's cousin and interviewed El Chapo's mother and sat through a 3-hour evangelical Christian mass because she's an evangelical Christian or evangelical service. But basically you are at their mercy and you have to say, well, I'm going here, I'm doing this work and that's what it is. It can be difficult and there's been tough experiences. It's been, I don't want to put myself alongside a lot of the people, the families who have died from this. There's been more than 150 journalists, almost all Mexican, a couple of foreigners, but the vast majority Mexican, who have died in the last 20 years, often almost always from the smaller towns, communities where the drug trafficking is strongest. Among them, one good friend of mine called Javier Valdez, who I do talk about in the book, and was a very prolific journalist who was shot dead in 2017. He was shot dead coming out of his office at midday, and assassins came and shot him dead. And that's one of many very sad cases.
Yeah, that was a nice tribute to him that you had in the book. And as someone who's done a lot of reporting around guns and gangs and drugs and other types of situations like that, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these situations too. And it seems like sometimes these people operating outside of the law actually appreciate journalists, and it gives them sort of like a chance to tell their story, and there's the risk, I suppose, of glamorizing it sometimes, but ultimately, I think they respect someone trying to really not be afraid to go there and learn the truth of what's really happening.
Yeah, it was interesting, the difference between interviewing criminals in the United States and criminals in Latin America. It's kind of so far gone on a different level really here, in terms of they are more like war criminals to an extent, or like guerrilla groups or paramilitary groups. A pitch I'll often make is, I want to tell your side of the story. You don't want young children going through, you have children yourself, with older people who are more responsive. There's plenty of times people tell me no. Where I get there, where I spend long times and days and weeks trying to get next to somebody or get into a prison, and then the person says, no, I don't want to talk to you, and I'm not going to talk to you. But also, but in the US, I think that people are also responsive. It was a very fascinating interview with this gun trafficker in Baltimore, and he was saying, at the end, he kind of went on this discourse where he was saying, look, why I don't, I was asking, how guilty do you feel about this? About the fact you're selling guns, and guns are used to commit murder. And he was like, well, we're not making guns in Baltimore. Why is it that this whole system is capitalist? And then when I succeed, I should feel bad about this. They're selling, they sell guns all over the place. They've got money and their infrastructure to sell drugs. This is the American dream. This is like so this kind of weird thing of how that plays out, and people are responsive to that as well.
When you think about guns in your own life, what does it kind of mean to you?
Yeah, so I grew up with no guns in the UK. There's not a gun culture, very limited gun culture. I'd been to the United States before, and I'd fired guns in the United States before. In the US, and again, I respect the US gun culture, but really, or I respect elements of the US gun culture. I respect, people. Really, my experience with guns has been covering the violence in Mexico and Latin America. I've seen many more dead bodies than I can count. started going to these crime scenes, seeing what these weapons do to people's faces, do to their bodies. First of all, arriving at those things, I had nightmares. I come back and think about, and sorry to be so graphic, but I think in a sense, this needs to be, get this across what this really means and how this really affects people. You see somebody's face torn up from an AR-15 bullets, AK-47 bullets. You see their wife at the scene. You see her face. You see the mother of a guy at the scene, her face, screaming hysterical at that moment. That really reaches me. So that really is a lot of what gun violence means, and I've seen and related to. I just, really, as a journalist, it's difficult simply to be telling the story. And how many more massacres can you just tell as a journalist and write about? How many more mothers can you interview who say, my son was dragged away by a commando of guys with guns who came into our house and dragged my son away from me. And he's not somebody who's a cartel involved guy who's like an 18-year-old philosophy student. How can you try and get this through and say, well, there's got to be a way to stop this. This is not like rocket science of this is like, there's not even an effort being made to stop the guns being used that are fueling this conflict. So that's kind of part of my own relationship, I think, to firearms and violence and how I see these issues.
Obviously, it's a very dark story that you're telling here, and it's the reality. But if there's something sort of positive that came out of this reporting for you and your experience, what might you focus on?
I think some of the spirit of people fighting on, and I mentioned a mother whose son, or many mothers whose sons have been taken away by gunmen. And in Mexico, there's been a whole movement that has been born of people searching for the disappeared. And this one mother who I profiled in the book, whose son was disappeared in 2013, and she was searching and searching. In 2017, they found this mass grave. And they found this because it was on Mother's Day, and they were marching, trying to find, and a guy drove up in a car and gave them a hand-drawn map, and they followed that to this field and started digging up themselves and found these bodies, and then the police took over. And eventually, after 2 years, her son's body was found there. Now, it's such a sad note to end on, but it was also herself fighting and pushing to close that. There's no closure for people not knowing what happened to her son. At least she had that closure. She has other children. And that spirit of fighting on that I see among people, like, again, Javi Valdez, this journalist who was covering these stories, again, passed away. But other journalists are still out there covering this stuff. The priest in the town of Apatingan, Michoacan, who was threatened for speaking out against the violence, and used to give mass in a bulletproof jacket. But again, he was doing this and speaking out about this stuff. And when I was in this neighborhood in Jamaica, and I was seeing this kind of generations of violence there, and like saying to a guy, is there any hope for this? And he said to me, there's always hope. And I think that line has stuck with me. There is always hope. One day this violence has to end or be reduced sometimes. And we've got to look for ways that can be sooner rather than later.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Jan. I really learned a lot from this book, so I really appreciate everything it took to write it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ben.